So it is Saturday, and we are talking about money, the answer about money. What is going on right now? What's happened? You know, there's a lot of news today about China, what's gone on in China and what they're doing with their tech companies. I think it fits a pattern. I think it fits a pattern that I've talked about before, but we're going to talk about it again today. Talk about what the implications are. But to really understand, we have to go back and think about what's happened in the Chinese economy and with China over the last few years. If you look at where we were, let's go all the way back to 1970. In 1970, the Chinese GDP was $92 billion. Compare that to the U.S. We were $1,073 billion, more than 10 times the size of what China was. You know, we were over $1 trillion at the time. Worldwide economy was $12 trillion. We were almost 10% of the world's entire economy. But China was just a minuscule part of that. If you go back and you look at what we were and where we're expected to be for this year, 2021, the Chinese economy is expected to be at $16.6 trillion compared to the U.S. economy of $22.4 trillion and the world economy of $93.8 billion, $93.8 trillion. That's a significant difference. The Chinese economy over the last 52 years has grown from 92 billion to 16 trillion. That's 181-fold. Compare that to the U.S. We were at 1 trillion, we're now at 22.4, a 21-time increase, while the world has been growing at 8 times. So how did that happen? What made that happen? You know, the fact is, they had a model. They indeed had a model. And that model was built on a model in France. And I'm looking at my notes, and my notes just got a little more complicated. We have to go back to France, 1661. Louis XIV, I call him Louis XIV. Louis XIV has just come to power, and he has a country which is pretty backwards. Not only were they backwards, but they'd fought 3 major wars and 2 minor wars in the previous 50 years. The country was essentially bankrupt. They were backward, they were bankrupt. Industry was mostly small crafts. They weren't really competitive worldwide. And they needed cash. They needed cash to make the economy grow. They needed cash for paying down their debt. And to do that, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, brought in John Baptiste Colbert in 1665 as his Secretary of the Treasury, as the person to take care of the Treasury. And John Baptiste Colbert did a remarkable turnaround in France. Now, in those days, you didn't have paper currency. Currency was, in fact, what they called specie. It was silver, it was gold, it was copper, it was coinage, what we call coinage today. And France had no gold mines. France had no silver mines. France didn't have the material to go out and mine and make coinage. So what they had to do is they had to build a trade surplus. And that's what Colbert set out to do. He set out to build industries, and he did. Glass industries, textile industries. He went out and enticed craftsmen and entrepreneurs from other countries to come to France, offering them very attractive incentives. For most, he offered a royal privilege, which meant no taxes for their business. The government of France would finance it. They would guarantee all the orders that the companies could produce so that there was no risk. You produce the product, it's paid for. You build the plants, the government's going to give you the money. You want to sell your products, you have no taxes to pay. Colbert sent spies to England and other countries to find the craftsmen and entrepreneurs, and they went out to steal the secrets from other countries. They stole secret production methods and processes and technology. They looked at the first English steam engines, and one of the first steam engines produced in the UK was shipped to France. They reverse engineered it to build French. They didn't have any respect for intellectual property. They copied it all. And having pirated an expertise and intellectual property, once it was in France, they needed to protect it. And they needed to protect the craftsmen as well. So if those people that immigrated to France were caught leaving, they might end up rowing on the king's galley. They might end up being executed. Colbert established a core of state-funded industries. And those industries were set up to produce high quality. There was an inspection that went around, and they checked the quality of the products that were being produced. And he set up to protect from outside the country, protect from competition. There were 15,000 small entrepreneurs that were actually executed for the crime of importing manufactured cotton cloth. There was a factory that was built to produce glass, and they imported some glass from Venice. And that producer was executed. So there was a tight control. Not only did you come to France, you were stuck in France. And they built factories. They built factories, 1,000 workers. That was something new in France. From the one-person or two-person shops, they were building factories, 1,000 workers. They were paying minimum wages. They put them up in dormitories. They were working on 14 to 16 hours a day. The only days off they had were religious holidays. And Colbert complained to the Roman Catholic authorities that there were too many religious holidays. He felt the workers needed to work many more days of the year. They had a large rural population, a large unemployment at the time this began. And Colbert wanted to encourage women to marry under the age of 20 so that they could produce more children to have more workers for the factories. But it wasn't just manufacturing. The Dutch dominated international trade. So what we know now as the Bordeaux region was mostly a swamp. Colbert filled that in. Colbert planted oak trees. Many of those oak trees ended up producing barrels. But they also produced ships for shipping French goods to compete with the Dutch. And the French were charging high fees for foreign ships that docked at their ports. They were protecting their dominance. And what happened is they built a trade surplus, and that funded the economy. And France moved from a backward nation into one of the leading nations. They became renowned for their quality, especially for their silks and their tapestries and fine glass. Some of those companies that were established at that time in the late 1600s exist today. Gobelin Tapestry is one of the major tapestry companies in the world, fine tapestry. Saint-Gobain, a glassmaker, making some of the finest glass in the world. Those companies were established during that time of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He didn't make many friends, either inside or outside of France, but he launched France onto a path of large-scale industrialization. That was the model that the Chinese looked at as they went forward in the 20th century. That explains what they have done and where they went. The Chinese, under communism, the party has created broad and centralized control, and they have a long-term development plan. They control the land. They control the economy. They control the military. They control the banks. They control foreign policy. And they decide whatever is of major importance, and while they've adopted some capitalist practices, they do it without giving up control. And like Colbert, they offered significant incentives for foreign manufacturing. In fact, 70% of Chinese exports are manufactured using foreign intellectual property. Think about that. 70% come from foreign intellectual property, not from property that's developed within China. That's changing, and we'll get to talking about that as well as we move forward. They built a domestic base. They have large companies in there, and the central government funds those companies. The central government actually supports them. Don't go away. We're coming back right after this to talk about the impact all of that's had on China and the world of investments. So I've been talking about China. China that went from 1970, $92 billion on the GDP to $16 trillion, an 880-fold increase. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And what's going on? They had a model with France. And I talked about the model of France, and I talked about the comparison with China. I mean, when you think about what's happening, China has induced companies from outside China to come in, just as France did under Colbert. They gave significant incentives, low-cost labor, modern infrastructure, and they convinced companies that manufactured that they could move in and China would support the export of their products. Think about this. Think about Takeo, for example. Boeing was a small partner, 15% in Takeo. And China took a large duck pond, they filled it in, they paved it over, and they built hangars. And they started a process of converting passenger aircraft to freighters, taking out the windows, redoing the exterior skin of the plane, taking out all the seats in the interiors, putting in conveyor belts, and building them for freight. That's a standard thing, but China did it in a huge way. They began that conversion, and within a few years, there were 15,000 workers. They lived in dormitories. They worked long hours and cheap labor. Same thing as I talked about with France. That's what China did. That was their focus. They were building those technologies, high-speed trains. You know, they built all those industries, taking a little bit of the technology, improving on that technology, and then moving forward. One of the big issues has been about intellectual property. And as we look forward to this whole thing, we're going to talk about intellectual property and where the Chinese are, because things have changed. But let me back up for a second to France. I talked about France. From a backward, almost bankrupt country under the direction of the Treasury Secretary Jean-Baptiste Colbert, France grew to a powerful nation. And you all know what happened. By 1789, a lot of people lost their heads. They lost it in the guillotine. And the French Revolution resulted in Napoleon rising to power. But Napoleon didn't have a backward country. He had one of the most powerful economic countries in the world at that time. And he began to expand it. Most of Spain fell under the French flag. So did Italy. So did most of what we now call Europe, even into Russia. That's what Napoleon did because he had the economic power to do it. And now we think about China in the same kind of role. Think about the old Silk Road, because China is beginning to rebuild the old Silk Road. Every 5 years, the Chinese hold a Congress. And in 2017, they held what they called, September of 2017, they held a conference. Xi Jinping had become the head of the Communist Chinese government and head of China. He was called by The Economist the world's most powerful man, and his message was to pursue the dream of rejuvenation. And their program was Made in China 2025. They wanted to dominate the world in several industries. They wanted to dominate the world in medical. They wanted to dominate the world in computers. They want to dominate the world in telecommunications. They want to dominate the world in electric vehicles. They wanted to dominate the world in advanced and basic materials. They wanted to dominate the world in mobile devices. They wanted to dominate the world in agricultural machinery. They want to dominate the world in robotics. They want to replace America as the world leader in those industries. That was Made in China 2025. Remember that. As we get later on, we're going to talk about that in terms of what's going on in China the last few months, because it all relates to Made in China 2025. They want to dominate the world. One of the issues that they have is intellectual property. And if you listened to a program a couple of years ago, you heard Adam Phillip talk about what's happening with intellectual property. Adam Phillip is an attorney. He has a Chinese branch, and he talks about, he's an intellectual property attorney. He talks about what has happened in the last few years. 5 years ago, when he had a conflict, his Chinese partner said to him, we're very lucky because we have a judge who has a high school education. 3 years ago, that went away. 3 years ago, there was a reorganization of the intellectual property because China got rid of all the old judges. The Chinese judges that are handling the intellectual property conflicts are now all college educated. They have really upgraded the system. But not only that, 5 years ago, China was producing about 200,000 patents. The Chinese government, with Made in China 2025, realized they needed to accelerate that. Today, the Chinese are developing over 2 million patents a year. 2 to 3 million patents a year. The Chinese government will pay people to develop patents. Not like here where you get a patent by paying an attorney 25 or 30 or 50,000 or 250,000 to get a patent. In China, the Chinese government will pay you to develop a patent. You get payments from the city, you get payments from the equivalent of the county, you get payments from the equivalent of the state, and you get payments from the federal government if your patent passes muster. That is all to reward the people to move forward with Made in China 2025 in those industries. And what's happened is the number of patents, I said, is 2 to 3 million now. In the U.S., we had about 300,000 or 400,000 patents 5 years ago. Today we have about 600,000 patents. So the Chinese government has significantly increased their intellectual property. That's what's happening. But that's only part of the story. That's the Made in China 2025. But they also began the Belt and Road Initiative, and I talked about the Silk Road. They offer loans and Chinese labor to countries with fewer resources. Take, for example, the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota, second largest port in Sri Lanka, and the Chinese government went in and offered to loan the Sri Lankan government all the money they needed to upgrade and make Hambantota one of the world's great ports. And they went in and they did that. They offered the loans. They offered Chinese labor to come in, and they offered Chinese technology to do that. And when the Sri Lanka government couldn't repay the loans, China repossessed. The Chinese companies repossessed the port, and they now anchor a quarter to half of the Chinese Navy in that port at Hambantota. The Chinese own that port. But it's not just there. They have investments they have Belt and Road initiatives in Pakistan, in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Georgia, Kenya. They are expanding everywhere in the world. They're rebuilding the Silk Road up through the north, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all those countries, but Turkey and Kazakhstan. They are loaning money. They're loaning money into places in Africa. In Liberia, for example, they loan money to build the roads. Not only that, they built the roads in such a way that when the monsoons come, the monsoons destroy the roads, and so the government of Liberia has to rebuy and get new loans to rebuild the roads. Eventually, China will own the roads. China will own power plants. They'll own railroads. They'll own transfer stations. The focus is to control that. And through the Silk Road on ice, they want to control the Arctic Ocean as well. The digital Silk Road is to control cyberspace. Now begin to think about all this in terms of where they're headed. Countries like Azerbaijan, Georgia, and some of Eastern European countries, they're moving in that direction. That's what they want to have. They want to own the power plants, the railroads, and the infrastructure. That's the focus of where they're headed with the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. And think about the digital Silk Road, what we're seeing in the last couple months with their takeover of those companies. They want those companies to be under Chinese control. They're willing to set those companies up so that China will determine what they do. China has a top-down approach. They want to control the industries. They want to control the companies. They're not concerned about the American shareholders or their shareholders. They want to control those companies, and they want to have those companies begin to dominate the world. And they're well on their way to doing that. All that has implications for investment. It has implications for investment in America. It has implications for investments overseas. They are moving to control what goes on. We're going to come back and talk about this right after this commercial break and talk about the implications and why it's so important to understand. Don't go away. So I've been talking about China, a country that grew from 52 billion in GDP in 1970 to 16 trillion today. And what the model was France, and what France did in the 1660s under Jean-Baptiste Colbert and under Louis XIV, how they grew France into an economic empire. China's done the same thing in the same ways. And China now has moved beyond that, because in 2017, they set up Made in China 2025 with the goal of dominating the world in these industries, medical devices, biotechnology, bioengineering. They want to dominate computers. They want to dominate telecommunications. They want to dominate electric vehicles. They want to dominate the technologies of advanced and basic materials. They want to dominate mobile devices. They want to dominate agricultural machinery. They want to dominate robotics, and they want to replace America as the world leader. That vision has truly become clear in 2021. Here we are in 2021, because what we're seeing is a focus on making China a techno-utopia. That's the focus. That's where they want to be, and they want to replace America. But they have certain companies that have grown. Tencent, Alibaba, Didi, those companies which are recently in the news as the Chinese government begins to curb their power. They want to curb their marketing power. They're taking their profits and distributing the profits not to the shareholders, but they're distributing those profits to smaller companies. And they're distributing the profits for works of smaller companies. Data generated by those companies, the Chinese government has become very aware of the power of data. We talk about oil and the significance of oil during the latter part of the 20th century. Data has become the new oil. Understanding data, owning data has become so important. The Chinese government, made in 2025, realizes the importance of data, and they want those companies to share their data with all other companies. Unlike Facebook, which generates it, or Amazon, or some of the U.S. companies that Netflix, Google, those companies that are generating data and understand the power of data. For the Chinese companies, they're going to be shared. They want their second-tier cities to have their own tech industries. It's not having a Silicon Valley. It's having secondary cities. And the funding for that from the big companies. They want their new priorities is for social fairness and national security. They want to control those companies. When you have a company that grows as great in power as some of the companies in the U.S., they have tremendous power, and they're able to do so many things with their power. They're able to influence the government. Not so in China. China wants the government to influence the companies, not the other way around. And they want to use those companies. We get to see the Chinese stock prices, the impact was almost immediate as the prices declined by 45%, and maybe they're even further down. I mentioned the industries in the beginning when I talked about China, the industries in which China wanted to control. They control the banks, they control the land, they control the education, they control the markets, they control TV, they control the marketing means. And the government wants to set the rules, not the companies. They don't want a free market. They want a government that will set the rules. Set the rules for the big companies, set the rules for the small companies. They were willing to allow some of these companies that have become so large, like Tencent and Alibaba and some of the others, to do their own thing because they were not in key industries. They are now key industries. And the government wants to control those. The government wants them to fall under the government's rules and not their own. It's an invest at your own risk right now. That's the Chinese focus. If you have Chinese investments, if you're thinking about Chinese investments, and if you're thinking some of these companies' stock prices have gotten hammered way down, think again. Think again about the implications of all this. They want to distribute the profits to competing companies. So think about it. Think about the impact if the U.S. government said to Amazon, we want you to distribute your profits to other online marketing firms. We want you to finance other online marketing firms that are going to compete with you. Think that would go well? I don't think it would go very well. Think of if they said to Netflix, oh, you're doing well right now, but we want you to make your technology available to a dozen other companies. Think that would really fly? Or to Google. The data you're generating, we want you to share that data with another 20 companies. We want them to have it. And we're going to locate those companies in 20 different cities so that those cities have employers who are using your data that you've generated to build their own companies. That's the focus. That's what's happening right now in China. They are top-down. And the picture is becoming very, very clear of what Made in China 2025 really means. They want to dominate the medical field, the medical technology, whether it be biotech, whether it be devices. They want to dominate that. They want to dominate in the computer field. They want to dominate in telecommunications. They want their companies to share that information. They want computer companies not to maintain their intellectual property. They want them to share their property with other companies in different cities to continue to grow that. They want to dominate electric vehicles. They're already making overtures, and I believe that Tesla is building a plant to build electric vehicles in China. We'll see how much is copied. They want to control advanced and basic materials. One of the huge products that's coming down the road, and we have to be aware of it, is what's happening with advanced materials. If you look at an oyster shell, it's made up of layers. And each of those layers has about the durability of a piece of paper. But when you stack them all together, you have an extremely hard shell. Materials like that are coming. New materials, graphene, and materials for ultra-high batteries, materials coming for moldable metals. All those materials are coming. China wants to dominate in those. And if they have a company that truly grows very rapidly, that company is going to share their profits and help other companies grow as well. They want to dominate medical devices. They want to dominate agricultural machinery. And in robotics, they need to dominate that field as well. They want to replace America as the world's leader. They want to establish, and they are establishing, conferences for the top scientists in the world. They're not drawing very many yet, but they will. They will pay for them to come. They will pay for them to speak. They will pay for them to present their papers and their studies. All of that's going on. That's Made in China 2025. We're beginning to see a clear view of how that's happening and how they plan to use it. They plan to share the data. They plan to share the profits. They want to build up their secondary cities. They want a techno utopia, curbing the market power of the biggest ones, distributing the profits, and building up tech industries in a number of different cities. They want the companies to have social fairness. And by social fairness, what they mean is not to dominate their industry, but if they dominate their industry, they want it to be shared. They want to use those companies for national security. They want the government to have access to what's going on in those companies. It's not just that the companies are going to generate data and share with other companies. Those companies are going to share their data with the Chinese government as well. Think about it. If the U.S. government asked Google to share their data, if the U.S. government asked Facebook to share their data, think if the government asked Apple, we'd like to know all your users, all their passwords, all their information, and we'd like to monitor the phone calls they make as well. It can be done. And we're going to see that in China. Invest there? I don't think I would make that venture. But we have to be very, very aware because they are going to be a significant competition with America. I think we win. But I don't think it's going to be an easy road. And I think there's going to be some losers along the way, America, and some in China. Anyway, when we come back, I will talk about some of those things as well and talk about international investing and where I stand in the bigger picture. So don't go away. I'll be right back after the commercial break. So I've been talking about China, specifically about China, a country that grew from 92 billion in GDP in 1970 to 16 trillion in 2021, or the expectation is to be at 16 trillion in 2021. But they're only part of the international scene. Every conference that I go to, every investment conference I attend, all the investment literature that I read, not all of it, but most investment literature I read, most gurus talk about international investing and the reason to do it, the advantages of global and international investing. And I believe there's risks that are beyond the scope of most analysis, and I believe there's some real risk. I talked about those risks talking about China, but it extends to the rest of the world as well. But I think it's important to understand there's no question that the world is changing. By 2030, the Brookings Institute forecast is that 93% of the world's middle class will live in developing nations. That means the middle class, they're defined as consumers. I tell the story, and you've probably heard it before, about one of my former clients, who was the plant manager for the American Standard plant in Tianjin, China. They had over 1,000 employees. They were manufacturing ceramic toilets, ceramic shower stalls, ceramic bathtubs. When they started that plant, not a single one of their employees had ever seen a ceramic toilet or a ceramic bathtub or a ceramic shower stall. Not one had ever seen, let alone used, a ceramic toilet, bathtub, or shower stall. They grew their own food. They made their own clothes. They rode bicycles. And they did their bartering for products. Today, those people have smartphones. They buy their food at grocery stores. They shop for clothes in department stores. They drive cars, and they drink lattes. That's the change that's gone on in China in the last 30 years. And by the end of this decade, 93 of the world's middle class will be like that, and that 93% of the world's middle class will live in those emerging nations. China, 30 years ago, 260 million people lived below the poverty level. Today, fewer than 40 million do. It's a big number, but it's declining, and that's true in India. It's true of most of the world. So you have a large brokerage firm, Goldman Sachs, who came out with a report that talked about the growth of these companies, of the emerging countries. They come out with this idea of BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Economies, they expected to grow much faster than the rest of the world. And the idea that by investing in emerging countries, you could make far more money than if you made just investments in the U.S. It sounded logical, it sounded reasonable, and it seemed to make investment sense. But that's not what the numbers show. Credit Suisse did a study that they looked at 83 countries from 1972 to 2009, and they ranked them by GDP growth for periods of the preceding 5 years. And investing in the markets of the highest growth countries yielded an average of 18.4%. Investing in the lowest growth yielded 25%. It was just the opposite of what reason would be. You would think that the highest growth companies would have the highest returns in their stock market, and the lowest growth would have the lowest. It was just the opposite. The Goldman Sachs study was based on a shortage of data. With Mexico, they had only 10 years of data. And there's a lot of other flaws that went on. I started my career in the aluminum industry by a company that was half French-owned and half American-owned. And I got to see the inside view of what goes on in a foreign company in a foreign country. And they sent, as an up-and-comer, and I was an up-and-comer with the smelter and the company's Pechene. I was an up-and-comer, and they sent me and my wife very shortly after we were married to France to learn the technology and to learn the processes. And in that time, I learned about the educational system. I learned that it's a very stratified system, and many of the very top executives went to school with the same people that work for the government. In fact, if you graduate in the top quarter of your class from the top 3 schools in France, Polytechnique, École de Mines, and Chantal, you don't usually go to work for a company. You go to work for the government for 20 years, and then you parachute into the very top jobs in those companies. So it was easy. When the government fell short in France on their budget, they just simply nationalized Pétionnet and nationalized Credit Lyonnais and nationalized companies at will. And when they were short again, they just sold stock to the public. I mean, that's a country that's very close to us, not all that different from the United States, and yet very different from China or Korea or Vietnam. The governments are very, very different from the governments in many African countries, Eastern European countries. So, but I learned from that. I learned that what happens there and the culture there is very different from the culture we're used to in America. And the controls are very different. As I talked about the companies in China and what's going on with Made in China 2025 and the impact of the Chinese government now directing those companies and in a top-down fashion. So it is in most of the rest of the world that the governments can actually dictate what companies do. I'm not fond of doing that, and yet I want to participate in the growth that we're seeing overseas. So how do I do that? Well, the reality is this. 50%, a little over 50% of the revenues of Standard & Poor's 500 companies, domestic companies, over 50% of their revenues are coming from overseas. Think about that. Half their sales come from America, half from overseas. If you look at all the companies in the United States, 43% of their sales come from overseas, 57% from the U.S. So that means you can participate in international investing by investing in the right companies in the U.S. You don't have to take the risk of an Alibaba or a Tencent and the government coming out and saying, we want to change what you're doing with your company. Don't have those kind of risks. You don't have the kind of risk of what happened with Pétionnet in the 1990s or Credit Lyonnais in the 1990s. You don't have to take that risk. You can make that investment in U.S. companies that have a significant overseas presence, benefit from the overseas, benefit from knowing that your companies are controlled by the laws of the United States and not by the Chinese government or by the Moroccan government or the Sri Lanka government or the government of Azerbaijan. You know where the laws are and what the controls are. That's my focus. That's what I do with my clients. That's what you should be doing if you're an investor. You should be looking domestically. You'll get international exposure by investing domestically. That's my advice. That's more of the story. Now you know more about China. Now you know more about international investing. I hope you have a very good investment time. It's been a good year. Last year was a good year. The year before that was a good year. I hope you're having a very good year with your investments. And until next Saturday, have a very good week, a very good rest of the weekend. And I will be back next Saturday